Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. My name is Sabrina Sohail, and I am the Director of Advocacy and Communications at Campaign for Uyghurs. Welcome to our parallel side event held with the NGO UN Committee of the Status of Women Forum 69. Today, we come together to address an urgent and critical issue: the Chinese government's reproductive control of Uyghur women and the role of surveillance and AI. Today, we will learn about the history of these atrocities, ground ourselves in the present reality, and discuss methods to demand justice and safeguard our future. We will also confront the limitations of the existing Beijing Declaration Platform for Action, which is undergoing its 30-year review. It is often regarded as a comprehensive framework for advancing gender equality worldwide. However, it has significant gaps, and since its adoption in 1995, new forms of state violence have emerged, especially by China, and we will address them. We are joined by an extraordinary panel of experts who will help us explore how China's state-sponsored demographic control intersects with modern surveillance technology and what that means for human rights advocacy moving forward. We have Rashan Abbas, founder and executive director of Campaign for Uyghurs and chairwoman of the executive committee of the World Uyghur Congress. She is a leading voice advocating for Uyghur human rights and exposing gender-based oppression. We have Dr. Adrian Zenz, China director at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He is a renowned anthropologist recognized for his groundbreaking research on demographic manipulation and human rights abuses in Xinjiang, or the Uyghur Autonomous Region. We have Dr. Sophie Richardson, co-executive director at the China Human Rights Defenders, a globally recognized expert on human rights in China with extensive experience in Chinese politics, democratization, and advocacy against state repression. And last but not least, we have Connor Healy, director of government research at IPVM, one of the world's leading authorities on video surveillance, security, and technology policy, who has extensively documented China's mass surveillance architecture. Thank you once again for joining us, and let's get started. I'd like to ask Rashan Abbas to speak first to lay the groundwork on the atrocities that the Uyghur people are facing currently.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you, everyone. Hello and happy Nowruz for those who celebrate today. I'm an Uyghur American. For those who don't know, we are culturally, historically, and linguistically tied to the Turkic people of Central Asia. Our land was occupied by the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, and until this point still. Xinjiang, the name was given to us back in late 1800, means new territory, but historically, geographically, and symbolically, we like to call our homeland East Turkestan. Under the pretext of national security, the CCP enforces Orwellian surveillance and military control in our homeland, while carrying out a full-fledged active genocide. In January 2021, the U.S. administration declared China's actions as genocide, followed by 11 other countries. And then United Nations has documented mass detention, torture, forced sterilizations, and family separations, stating those atrocities may amount to crimes against humanity. The bodies of the Uyghur women are the true battleground, the battlefield for those atrocities. Uyghur women are subject to forced sterilization, forced abortions, family separation, forced marriages to Han Chinese men, and the intrusive surveillance. If an Uyghur woman doesn't comply with those forced IUD placement, or refuses to marry a Han Chinese man, her and her entire family are arrested as being extremists. The Chinese government's own state media reported that 1.1 million Han Chinese cadres, mostly male, has been deployed into the Uyghur homes to supervise and monitor their daily lives. While most of the Uyghur men are taken to the forced labor facilities or prisons or detention centers, the Uyghur women are subject to sexual abuse inside of their own homes. Can you imagine your home, the place that's supposed to be safest place that's becoming worse than a prison for you? In 2018, in 2018, 24 members of my husband's family back home disappeared. And when I spoke publicly about the genocidal policies and the fate of my in-laws in Washington as an American citizen, my sister Gulshan Abbas, a retired medical doctor, devoted herself to healthcare, a law-abiding, just ordinary citizen, just living an ordinary life. She was taken hostage and detained by the CCP. It has been 6.5 years now. Martin Luther King Jr. rightly once said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If the genocidal policies against my people are not confronted today, generation after generation will perish after the same oppressive methods. We are all responsible for what happens next, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rashawn, for sharing and laying the groundwork for the atrocities that are happening in the Uyghur region. And next, I'd like to invite Dr. Adrian Zenz to speak about his research on these forced sterilizations.
Thank you indeed. It was in 2019 when I was looking at the campaign of mass internment and evidence on the Uyghur situation that I also attempted to assess the percentage of Uyghurs in camps using population data and noticing that we could get detailed data on the breakdown of births and death rates for Uyghur prefectures and even counties. I noticed by coincidence a dramatic decline in these rates, in birth rates, particularly in southern Uyghur homeland regions. I then immediately kind of thought that this was connected to the campaign of mass internment. When the men are in camps, reproduction suffers. However, it turned out, and then I wrote a detailed research report on this, which was published in June 2020 and formed the basis for the US government's genocide assessment. I discovered that the reason for the dramatic declines in birth rates was a targeted attack on the Uyghur reproductive apparatus, on Uyghur women, through sterilization, through forced insertions of intrauterine devices, following specific policies mandating a dramatic reduction in Uyghur birth rates. So the methodology for this research consisted in local government statistics, Xinjiang statistical yearbooks, and policy analysis. We also found evidence that in 2018, Uyghur women who refused birth prevention methods were subject to internment in the re-education camps. I have brought a couple of slides along here that we can show now. The first slide shows sterilizations per 100,000 of the population, and we see that in Xinjiang for 2017 and 18, these increased dramatically at the same time as the national sterilization rates per capita were actually declining because China was loosening and then abolishing its one-child policy. So among the Han Chinese, birth rates were now no longer subjected to the kind of preventative measures. At the same time, these measures in Xinjiang were ramped up dramatically. Next slide, please. And then a further investigation indicated that birth rates further declined between 2018 and 19 in Xinjiang's ethnic minority counties. This is the yellow bar. This decline was particularly pronounced with around 50%, whereas in Han counties, it was 20%. Nationally, the decline was 4%. And of course, since then, China's birth rates are declining because the Chinese are having less children. But in Xinjiang, these declines have been far outstripping sort of anything that we have ever seen before. Now, we can move on from the slides now. If we look at the United Nations and the definition of genocide, for example, we see that one of the measures that is associated with the Genocide Convention, Article 2, Item D, is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And I will speak about this in subsequent question rounds here. We have the fact of dramatic birth rate declines that are linked to a systematic state policy of preventing births among this group, the Uyghurs and other ethnic groups in the region. And at the same time, we also have an understanding of the intent of the state by seeing Uyghur populations as a threat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zenz, for providing that data for us. And next, I'd like to invite Dr. Richardson to speak about how this persecution fits into the broader governance style of the CCP.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It's always a pleasure to be with Campaign for Uyghurs and with my other friends, Adrian and Connor, on the panel. I think my job is to try to do a whole lot of history in 3 minutes. And I think the two important points that I want to make are about the Chinese government's and the Chinese Communist Party's control of women's reproductive rights and bodily autonomy over the last several decades. I think some of our listeners will be familiar with the one-child policy, which the Chinese government put in place in 1980, both to control the size of the population, but also to try to minimize rural to urban migration and to take some pressure off the economy. But it's important to understand that both on its face, this policy was highly abusive and fundamentally in tension with international human rights law, but also the ways in which it has been carried out, from violent forced sterilizations and forced abortions, but also through coercive measures and a lack of adequate medical care. The one-child policy really became synonymous with the abuses and the abusive nature of the policy itself. And it was not an improvement from a human rights perspective when the government shifted, starting to realize that birth rates across the country were plummeting, to the two-child policy and then to the three-child policy. And these are policies that have played out or been deployed with varying degrees of repression across the country. But I think it's important to understand that these policies have been in place for decades and harmed women across the country. I realize today we're focused particularly on Uyghur women. And in that context in particular, we've certainly seen Adrian's work, recent work done by Ryan Thum, looking at rates of forced sterilizations, but also of birth rates and whether those have gone up or down. But the point that Adrian made a moment ago, I want to particularly emphasize that in the Uyghur region, a faith-based and a culturally based resistance to family planning policies was considered by authorities to be evidence increasingly of extremism, and led to, I think, greater and targeted persecution of women and their families, particularly around reproductive rights. And it was in roughly 2017 or 2018 that we started to see language that really conflated these two variables, and I think brought a particular kind of political attention to women's reproductive rights, and not in a positive way. And so not only have human rights organizations been able to document horrific abuses of Uyghur women in terms of reproductive rights in their regular daily lives, but also in forms of arbitrary detention. And you can see that as the authorities continue to be very anxious about declining birth rates, that some of the policies that have flowed from that are not less abusive. So I want to emphasize that these problems are ongoing, and particularly linked to the point that Rushan made about the need to find pathways to accountability for the people who are responsible for crimes against humanity and genocide.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richardson. And now I'd like to invite Mr. Healy, if you could speak about AI and surveillance and how it's been weaponized against the Uyghur people.
Thank you, and it's so good to be here. I'm going to start with a somewhat off-topic example. In 2012, there was a pretty famous story in the New York Times about a woman, a young teen, who received some coupons from Target for pregnancy-related products, and was not aware that she was pregnant. Target had figured it out before she did. What's interesting about that story, I think, is that it presages or forebodes really something quite sinister that I think is really starting to take shape now. The way that I think this should be understood is that anything that corresponds with behavioral change, anything that can be, in other words, seen or that can be detected, can in principle be automatically tracked. And issues surrounding fertility and many sort of issues specific to women fall under that category. And the choice to abuse technology with adverse effects on women is one that the CCP very much has the means to make right now, and has in fact made in certain cases. There was an example in 2022 after the floods in Henan province, in which authorities there implemented a system to, in particular, track migrant women. Other examples of this sort of persecution of a particular category that come to mind, drug users, for instance. Last year, or in 2023, Hikvision won a contract to automatically detect if university students were fasting for Ramadan, an application so grotesque and ridiculous it almost sounds made up, but it is true. They use dining records and video surveillance and a few other data sources. So, I mean, anything, any repressive activity that requires a significant amount of analysis would in the past have been more limited. You can think of it as a chain of sort of three things. There's the surveillance and the observation in the first place of people in general. There's the decision that something falls into a category that you want to repress, for instance, the fertility of Uyghurs. And then there's taking action on it. And both of those first two things are now not only automated, but so much better. It's only recently that it's become the case that it's possible to watch everyone in a thorough way, and also possible to outsource what would require thousands of people working endlessly analyzing data to computers. I want to go to my slides because there's a specific development that I think this is the first time I've spoken about this actually publicly, something we've been working on. And I think it's important that people are aware of it. So this is an announcement from Hikvision from about 3 weeks ago. And if you could actually just go to the next slide, it'll be easier to explain. It used to be the case that in order to develop targeted surveillance analytics, they were built for purpose, basically. That so Uyghur face detection, for instance, a famous example. You had to run thousands of images of Uyghurs through machine learning. You had to train an algorithm to do this. In the last few months, this just being released in February, that paradigm has been broken. So what this technology can now do, and it's effectively based on generative AI, is you can enter any use case, any description, anything that you want to track, and so long as it's feasible, will return results. In this example, you see person wearing red, right? And although this is a mundane example, the key point to focus on here is that this system was never trained to detect red. It just knows. And we've been testing it in our facility. We've received results from systems like this for various grotesque things that I shouldn't say. But for instance, people that it will give you results for people who should be put in detention camps. This allows technology to be deployed at even lower cost for almost any conceivable, not any conceivable. Anyone who wants to automate a repressive action faces lower and lower barriers to doing so. This, I think, is a cascading, calamity for the world that is growing out of Xinjiang. And because technology can make our society better, but China's philosophy and how they want to use this technology, whether it be against women, against Uyghurs, or against their own people in general, is fundamentally incompatible with how I think the West sees things.
Thank you, Connor. That new technology is absolutely chilling, and it is up to date. This has just been released, and you ended on a really important point that leads into a question that I wanted to pose to you, Dr. Zenz. The CCP's ideology, is there a specific ideological or strategic motivation that is driving the CCP to suppress birth rates? And how might eugenics factor into this?
Yes, so we do know, of course, that also for the whole country, China has for a long time been trying to optimize its population quality, the Chinese concept of suji, or quality, which is applied in many ways, and which is in a relation to family planning, well, the euphemistic term for birth prevention is a eugenic term. Now, continuing from what I presented before, I was able to assess various discourses by government-sponsored scholars, scholar officials, who were talking about some very chilling motivations to reduce birth rates. So, for example, as you see on the slide, in 2015, the dean of the Institute of Frontier History at Tarim University said that Xinjiang must change the population structure and layout and the dominance of the Uyghur ethnic group. And this is in reference to sort of a threat perception that the Uyghurs are a large and concentrated population, making up the majority population in one particular region. And at the CCP has struggled to break through Uyghur society as a result. And really chilling assessments from scholars and officials in relation to concentrated Uyghur populations. The next slide, please. So from that, one of the most concerning and high-level statements made in July 2020 is by Liu Elei, Deputy Secretary General of the ex-PCC's party committee, also Dean of Xinjiang University, who said that the problem in southern Xinjiang is mainly the unbalanced population structure. Population proportion and population security are important foundations for long-term peace and stability. That, by the way, is a sentence quoted from Xi Jinping's secret speech at the Second Xinjiang Central Work Forum in 2014. So even back then, there was a lot of concern about population structure and proportions. He goes on to say now that the proportion of the Han population in southern Xinjiang is too low, less than 15%. The problem of demographic imbalance is southern Xinjiang's core issue. And he says this at a time where many Uyghurs were put in re-education camps, where birth rates were already plummeting. And at the same time, the state was incentivizing 300,000 Han Chinese settlers to move into ex-PCC regions at the time. Ex-PCC, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, sort of a paramilitary colonial settler entity in the region. Next slide, please. And other scholars, in this case from a Xinjiang Police Academy researchers, identify what they call the human problem, optimizing the proportions of the population and enhancing the quality of the population. There you have that eugenics terminology. And they say solving the human problem is the foundation for solving Xinjiang's counterterrorism problem. The human problem meaning the inability to control the population in multiple ways. And then he goes on to list a number of problem populations that need to be diluted. It says the proportion of the poor population, of the unemployed, of the low educated, of certain ethnic groups, and of population with a criminal history. And these chilling discourses point us towards some of the intention of the regime that underpins some of these more drastic measures to slash Uyghur population growth.
Wow. So then my next question is for Sean. So with this ideology, why is the Chinese government targeting Uyghur women? You said that Uyghur women are the battleground for this genocide, their bodies.
Yeah, the Chinese government targets Uyghur women because the Uyghur women are the backbone of our society and the barriers of our future. So the CCP recognizes that, and controlling Uyghur women, they understand that it's controlling the reproduction, family structure, and the transmission of the Uyghur language, tradition, and the beliefs. So they are central to, the Uyghur women are central to Beijing's genocidal strategy. As a part of their genocidal policies, they are targeting the Uyghur women. The Uyghur women are surveillance to ensure no Uyghur, the government is basically controlling everything. So no Uyghur language are spoken. So religious activities are not taking place. Nothing about Uyghur heritage and identity are passed down to the future generations. That's why.
And the Chinese government often says that these birth control policies are in place in order to uplift the Uyghur community or uplift the economy of China. I'd actually like to pose this question to the panel. What do you think about this statement, and how has your research or experience showed otherwise?
Sabrina, I'm happy to jump in and take a first stab at this to point out that one of the ways in which the Chinese government is frequently, its policies are frequently in tension with international human rights law is that the government wants to say that it gets to decide which rights people have and which rights it will withhold from them. And as is the case with virtually all human rights, they are individually held. They're not for states to give and take away. And so, the idea that, reproductive choices should be not just controlled, but literally dictated by the state is remarkably in tension with international human rights law. And, there are larger consequences to controlling those particular rights, as Rushan has just elaborated what the not just the demographic, but the cultural consequences can be. And I think it's just important to understand that this is conduct where the state has no role. That international law could not be clearer on this topic, that the right to have or not have children belongs to an individual, not to a state to limit or to otherwise control. So maybe that helps answer part of the question.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Dr. Zenz, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, especially on the economic front as well, for Uyghur society and the Uyghur women.
Yes, so it's, of course, a remarkable tension also that China is now trying to boost birth rates nationally while they've been slashed in Xinjiang. And the regime's claims that birth prevention, boosts income, cuts poverty, re-engineers society, is actually very much linked to its politics of control over the region. So one of the false discourses that we say is a false narrative of feminist liberation, that Xinjiang's policies are liberating Uyghur women to no longer be baby-making machines, as was famously posted by the US Embassy, quoting from a research report by one of the scholars at Xinjiang University. This is related to a strategy of control, of putting Uyghurs to work, of changing the entire demographic structure. So the strategy of demographic engineering is designed to remake Uyghur society in the image of the CCP, according to understanding of the state, restructuring it in so many ways as a strategy of demographic engineering.
Okay. So, Mr. Healy, what are the current surveillance technologies that are being used in the Uyghur region to track and control the Uyghur people?
So there are a number of different inputs. The one that I'm most expert in is surveillance-related technology. It's often discussed how much you can learn about somebody from the data that comes from their cell phone. All of that data, by all appearances, is collected. There is good evidence from a variety of sources showing that that these phones are sort of designed to be accessible by the government. And so, in other words, they're tracking what you do on the internet and who you communicate with, what you're interested in, your digital footprint. Video surveillance and facial recognition in particular, what's so important about it as an input is its ability to tie an action to an identity. Video surveillance provides all sorts of things that don't necessarily happen on your phone. Where you're going, who you might be with or in proximity to. There are any number of analytics that can be performed on people. But those are sort of two of the main data sources. In tenders, you often see references, of course, to sort of static sets of data that have been collected on people. Their biometrics, their sexual orientation, whether or not they are carriers of particular diseases, whether or not they're suspected democracy supporters, and so on. It's not clear to me how those categories are assessed. I think it probably depends on the authority or the case. To summarize, there's very detailed surveillance. It's not technology you can escape. Even if you did get an unregistered phone into Xinjiang, they've installed MAC address sniffers in the region that will detect it anyway. So at least technologically, I think to say that it's an open air prison rings true to me.
Okay. And then, Dr. Richardson, your work was also crucial to reverse engineering the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which aggregates vast amounts of data. Could you speak to the type of data that is aggregated and how it was used to target Uyghurs?
Sure, although I also want to back up, Sabrina, and take another stab at the question you asked a minute ago, which is to say that if the Chinese government was really interested in supporting Uyghur women, it would respect their rights. It would not arbitrarily detain them. It would not impose decisions on them about whether and when and how many children they could have. It would free Dr. Gulshan Abbas. It would let Uyghurs come and go from the region. There's a long list of, I think, priorities that Uyghur women themselves would identify that don't have anything to do with Chinese government policies that try to undercut their rights. So on the IJOP, This is work that I did with my marvelous former colleague, Maya Wong, who's still at Human Rights Watch. I want to make sure she gets credit where it's due. We had been working sort of down two separate tracks. It was a time when we were increasingly aware of very large-scale arbitrary detentions. We were trying very hard to understand why those were taking place and what authorities wanted to know about people, what they were considering what behavior the authorities considered problematic. We had also been developing a body of work looking at uses and abuses of surveillance technology. And we had heard a little bit in the course of this research about a platform called in Chinese the Yitihua. And to make a long story short, Maya found a piece of it, and we decided to reverse engineer it to understand what the thinking behind it, what this platform was, what it did, what kind of information the authorities sought to gather. And it was a region-specific program that had been designed for police that aggregated enormous amounts of data about people and essentially flagged behavior that the IJOP determined to be potentially threatening and problematic. And it could trigger investigations, it could trigger detentions. And this platform drew on a number of different streams of information. Some of it was what's the information that's available through a national identity card, through household registration status. Oh, thank you very much for adding that slide. It makes it much easier for people to see what kinds of information this platform aggregated. And the particular kinds of bio data in the IJOP were things like blood type, height. Often the IJOP would offer up an image, and police would stop people and see if the image that they had on file matched the person who was standing in front of them with a national ID number. And this was developed at the same time that authorities in the region were under this broader Strike Hard campaign, also gathering things like DNA samples, fingerprints, iris scans, and voice samples. And so the authorities essentially had huge amounts of biodata on people to know, to be able to identify people, to identify the relationships between them, and to track their behavior in an incredible level of detail. Connor has just cited some examples from his own work, but one of the IJOP functions that was particularly striking was that largely through surveillance cameras and other tools that are just widely available across the region, if the IJOP flagged a visual image of a person putting gas in a car, and that person's image did not match the car's ownership, it would flag to the local authorities that they should stop that person and find out why they were putting gas in somebody else's car. Let me be very clear, there's no international legal or domestic legal prohibition against putting gas in somebody else's car. It's not a crime. But essentially, the authorities had just hoovered up oceans of data, in ways that are violations of the right to health, the right to privacy, and ultimately, as we saw this campaign of mass arbitrary detention unfold, including prosecutions or detentions that had been triggered by the IJOP, gross violations of the right to presumption of innocence or any kind of due process. So it's a pretty Orwellian example of how a particular technology can be deployed, and in a context where people had no ability to challenge the information in the IJOP or how it was used. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what kinds of technology the authorities have used, and as far as I know, have not stopped using.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. That is an incredible amount of data that the Chinese government has access to. And I'm interested in what specifically they are targeting in regards to Uyghur women. Dr. Zenz, when you uncovered your research on the forced sterilizations, did you get any insight on how the CCP determined which women to target specifically?
There was a clear target on southern Xinjiang, and there was also a clear target on women in rural ethnic minority regions. So women in the countryside who are known to have larger families, who live in traditional households and contexts. These turn out to be a particular target. And then within these and among these groups, there was also a specific focus on women who had already had 1 or 2 children. And I think especially the sterilization programs were targeting women who have had at least 1 child. And there was a concern, which is ironic because at the same time they were loosening the birth restrictions and allowing everyone to have more children.
Rashawn, how long has the Chinese birth control policies been in place for the Uyghur people specifically?
As my friend Sophie mentioned earlier, China's one-child policy has been implemented in 1979, restricting the Han population to have only 1 child. And at that time, actually, it started with the Uyghurs allowing to have 2 children. But when you look at our population and the vast land we have, we were actually not very happy with that, implementing birth control policies. So in 1985, about 40 years ago, when we organized the Uyghur students' protest at Xinjiang University against the China's repressive policies against Uyghur people, the birth control policy that we were protesting against was one of them, one of our demands. So families are fined, if anybody has more than 2 children. So, and some parts implemented harsher than the others. But from the time, like when I was pretty young, I was only like 17, 18 years old, I used to hear my mother, being a medical doctor, getting really upset and frustrated about how for some of the rural area, the infant survival rate is pretty low. The Uyghur kids, Uyghur babies, or young children, they get sick or they don't have enough healthcare measurements. So before age of 1, there's a pretty high rate that we lose Uyghur children or Uyghur babies. But soon after the woman have her second baby, they forcibly sterilizing her permanently. So even if she loses the other child, then she won't able to have another baby. So those are actually happening for a long time. And so many kids who are being born, the children being born beyond the limit, are not allowed to register for IDs and making them illegal citizens. And then they also implemented like, you can only have kids after this many years. So if you have 1 baby and you are pregnant and want to have another baby after a year or a year and a half, or like less than 2 years, I think the limit was you need to have 3 years in between, then they don't register the other baby. My brother, actually, my oldest brother, Nijat, he has 2 daughters. They are about 15, 16 months apart, but they are registered as twins on the same day. So that's just one example. So today, with overwhelming evidence from leaked documents and first-hand testimonies, we know these practices have expanded to include family separation, mass surveillance, forced abortion, forced sterilization, and all that. The Uyghur men and the women are detained in camps, given heavy sentences for having more children, and then allowed, while the Han Chinese men are offered financial incentives, jobs, and opportunities, and the other benefits, healthcare benefits, or money to marry Uyghur women who have no choice but to comply. So basically, Chinese government's goal is clear: erase Uyghur identity and the lineage.
And Sophie, both you and Rashawn have mentioned that these policies have been in place for a while, the one-child policy, these policies against Uyghurs. Why has the international community been so slow to respond? I feel that the one-child policy was very normalized during that period of time. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sabrina, it's a huge question. I think the Chinese government justified its policy as essential for economic development. And I think there was a certain amount of skepticism outside the country about whether it was really true. The number of people who focused on the issue or were able to document it, I think found difficulty getting audiences with governments or with international agencies that might have helped make a difference. I mean, I also think it's just a profound statement about misogyny globally, that these issues are not of greater concern. It's also very difficult to investigate and pursue any sort of accountability or impose consequences on Chinese officials for these abuses, because governments generally don't want to challenge Beijing, at least on these kinds of issues. Human rights have long been subordinated to other issues in bilateral relationships and in multilateral discussions. And I think it is a general failure to have more robustly challenged Beijing over human rights abuses for decades that essentially suggested to the current leadership that it could commit the worst crimes under international human rights law and expect to get away with them.
Okay. So I want to go a little bit forward thinking now. And Connor, I might ask you a series of questions, actually. So we know that the CCP has gathered an immense amount of data on the Uyghur population. And I'm going to show this slide that gives general overview of the different types of data that the CCP has access to in regards to Uyghurs. With the current technology that exists right now, and with this data, what are the capabilities of the system in China to target Uyghur women specifically?
Well, I'll start by sort of going off of something Sophie just said about the state of concern for misogyny globally, which I think is a point well taken. And what I would say is that the ability to use data, such as what you see on the screen here, to track on a really granular level what it is that people are doing, and to control behavior, it cannot be considered in isolation. It is a human rights issue, but it's very much also a geopolitical issue, a security issue. So these technologies, as applied in other regions already, there's a report that came out last week on a fact-finding mission that the Human Rights Council did in Iran that reported that, and Iran's been working on this for some time, that they're using what's described as facial recognition to detect if women are violating the hijab mandate. The idea is to enforce using data at scale, whatever edict the authorities desire. And so if it sounds like I'm not answering your question, it's because there are certainly things that you can't do with this data, but there's such a wide variety of things that you can. It's really up to the user. This, I think, is why I am, although I'm very sympathetic to the cause of data privacy, I am sometimes a bit baffled by those who draw an equivalency between how China uses data, or rather the ends to which it uses data, and the ends to which Silicon Valley uses data. Data collection can be a concern in both contexts, but these are just simply not the same issue at all. And we see that in the subject of this discussion. So I think that it really remains to be seen exactly what kinds of applications are successful and what aren't. But in general, anything that a human with a lot of resources could track, I think that a computer, generally speaking, can also track, but at much lower cost.
So, given this information that they have right now, can the CCP identify, and even the technology that you shared earlier for Hikvision, can the CCP identify somebody who is pregnant?
Well, I mean, I would say yes. In part, the question is at what stage, right? Because at a certain stage, it's sort of obvious to all of us visually, right? But I think that I keep thinking about the example Sophie gave about the gasoline. And the reason I'm going back to this is because I assume that buying gasoline without being the registered owner of a car was some kind of indicator that either you're not following a rule, or maybe you're going to use the gasoline to do something bad, or but really all you've done is you've borrowed someone's car, right? And so I think part of the question here is not just are they going to be able to tell if women are pregnant, but how often are they going to interrogate women who aren't pregnant because they bought cranberry juice or something? This approach is unfortunately somewhat common in China. From what I've seen, sort of in a lot of tenders, these indicators are used to trigger intervention that almost approach being a little bit nonsensical and sort of totalitarian in an almost ridiculous sense. But yes, to answer your question, I think that certainly with the right data sets, you can tell if somebody's pregnant.
Okay. So, Rashawn, in your advocacy for women's rights and to counter these very oppressive reproductive policies, and even bringing light to this massive surveillance system in China, what are the roadblocks that you've experienced in your advocacy?
A lot. Where do I start? The international entities, especially the United Nations, is not working at all. And many of the feminists and all the people who are supposed to speak out and protect women's rights, they are silent, because there is a silence when you speak out against. I mean, there's consequences when you speak out against the CCP, and when the perpetrator of those crimes are powerful and they have money and the power, many of them stay silent. Just listening to Adrian and the Sophie and the Connor for such insightful and detailed information on this subject of the atrocities that the CCP is conducting using AI and the technology against the women. When I look at this event, China hosted the 1995 Beijing conference as like one of the strategic moves to present itself as a responsible global player and the champion of women's rights, aiming to rehabilitate its international image after 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. But when you look at the Beijing Declaration, everything there, how they say that they recognize the rights of the having a child, and well, actually they didn't explicitly recognize that, but everything they said, that what kind of rights they are giving for women and all that is complete lies. As Sophie clearly said, if you are respecting women's rights, if you are trying to help them, uplifting them, and they help them to develop their careers, you don't put them in the jail. You don't put them in the camps. You don't forcibly sterilize them or give them abortions in the last stage of the pregnancies. We know that so many babies are being born when they give the forced abortions. And they are, as Connor explained clearly, their modern surveillance is tracking every move of the Uyghurs, and the CCP's genocide is conducted through racism, combining with the cutting-edge technology that they are using for this genocide. So, I often ask myself, as I mentioned earlier, where are all the women's rights and activists and feminists? Why did none of them speak out for the Uyghurs? And why Peng Liyuan, Xi Jinping's wife, is representing the women and the girls at the United Nations as special envoy. It needs to be, talked about the media, but why the media is not covering. Right now, actually, the genocide is still continuing. The Uyghur birth rate dropped down to almost 0% in some of the Uyghurs populated areas. Dr. Adrian Zenz have a lot of reports on this, but we don't see this being covered on the media. We don't see the governments are mentioning. Public sentiment on the issue needs to change, and it will only begin once people start to talk about it. So the roadblocks are China's disinformation and the false propaganda, and now they are massively arranging those tours to invite influencers and the journalists and the diplomats to go and visit our area and show, happy Xinjiang picture, quote unquote, showing them the Uyghurs are singing and the dancing and everybody's happy. And China is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and one of the largest contributors to the United Nations after the United States. So they hold both soft and hard economic power to sway crucial processes. So, yeah, it's frustrating, but as I always say, this is not just about the Uyghurs anymore. It's not going to stay with the Uyghur people or atrocities against Uyghur women. It's about the future of the free world that we need to worry about.
Thank you. And Dr. Zenz, what will be the future of the Uyghur people long-term if these policies are not addressed? What is the long-term impact?
If we take the UN risk framework published in the 2010s as our guide, which contains risk indicators for mass atrocities linked to crimes against humanity, linked to genocide, a lot of these risk indicators are correspond to what we're seeing in the region. There's significant risk of an ongoing genocide. This is compounded by the fact, firstly, that we are seeing a lack of data, that population data is not being published. Birth rates for Uyghur regions are not being published anymore after my report came out in 2020. And we are seeing a continued language of securitization, counterterrorism, and forced labor. And I'm also very concerned that especially forced labor transfers of Uyghurs are a strong aspect of the project of demographic engineering. They're tearing apart organic communities. They're separating parents from children. And that this has a major impact on the affected communities. There's significant concern, especially since information is not being disclosed about what some of the things are happening. Many Uyghurs remain in forms of detention and imprisonment, and there's no way to have unfettered access or examination, independent examination, investigation. It was denied to the UN. It's being denied to the ILO, who has been asking about it, and therefore we need to consider this to be an urgent situation.
Thank you. And Dr. Richardson, what are the legal avenues, or this question is for anyone, what are the legal avenues and what is something that people even watching this call can do in order to counter this forced reproductive control?
Well, broadly speaking, we're familiar with structures like international tribunals, for example, or investigative mechanisms. And typically these are institutions that are established through different kinds of UN, United Nations bodies. I think that's proven to be an extremely difficult path, largely as a result of the efforts and the resources that the Chinese government sinks into preventing even a conversation about these abuses, let alone steps towards efforts to actually gather evidence and bring forward some sort of judicial mechanism. But I think there are a couple of other paths that governments should continue to consider. CHRD, my organization, published a report recently looking at arbitrary detention, patterns of arbitrary detention of human rights activists and people who don't even necessarily consider themselves activists, but were advocating on behalf of human rights. And part of what we were trying to do was amplify one of the UN expert groups' repeated findings that the scope and scale of arbitrary detention across the entire country may constitute a crime against humanity. And we're trying to help re-engage or recatalyze a discussion about what a UN-based response to these crimes would look like. But those are difficult. And that said, there's nothing that prevents any government that wanted to start opening investigations into these kinds of abuses, if there are people in their own countries who've been affected by them. There's nothing that prevents governments from actually starting investigations themselves, even if the alleged perpetrators of the crimes are in other countries. And this is particularly true in governments in countries that have what are called universal jurisdiction statutes, meaning that even if the crime hasn't taken place in that country, one could still open an investigation and start gathering information. And I continue to think that would be a powerful way, first of all, of recognizing the experiences and the suffering of victims and survivors, but would also be something of a deterrent to the officials to know that the complicit officials to know that other governments were actually starting to gather information about their involvement in possible crimes. There are all different kinds of mechanisms with varying degrees of capacity to impose actual penal sentences, for example. And although the Chinese government is not a party to the Rome Statute, which is what the International Criminal Court is based on, crimes against humanity are considered customary international law, meaning you don't have to have signed on to that treaty in order to be investigated and held accountable. So, but those are largely political decisions about whether governments are willing to come together to actually pursue those kinds of strategies. But it's not beyond the realm of the possible. And I have to say that having worked in the past on human rights abuses in the Philippines in the context of the drug war there, that watching former President Rodrigo Duterte be surrendered to the International Criminal Court and flown to The Hague, where he's going to be investigated, or where he will be prosecuted, I think should ring the alarm bells in the minds of any authoritarian leader that this could happen to them, and that perhaps they want to rethink whether they're going to continue committing serious human rights crimes.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists have anything else to add in terms of action items or interventions?
Yeah, definitely. I think that in the West, we have this sort of unspoken idea that technology is something that America builds and others buy. And I think that Xinjiang is a place that shows us that China is now building its own vision of what technology is and what it can be used for without our say or input. And I bring this up simply to say that I think that we're all fumbling the ball on this one globally. My concern is that many decades from now, Xinjiang will be remembered not just for the genocide that's taken place there, but as a pivotal moment, for our species in which something utterly new and completely perverse was invented and spread to other places, like Iran, as the example I mentioned, like in Kabul, where thousands of Dawa cameras have now been installed, or Saudi Arabia, where they're setting up a manufacturing plant. The advantage that democracy and human rights, I think, to some extent have is, in addition to sort of moral superiority, is a certain degree of stability that can be harder to come by in authoritarian countries. My concern is that these technologies are making them quite a bit more stable, and this is a big security issue for us. So my recommendation is to get serious about a coherent stance on the use of technology by governments, basically. Whatever that stance happens to be is something that needs to be negotiated. But we have the opportunity to compete, to sell our own vision of how technology can improve society. It's even a business opportunity, you could say. We should do this. We should pursue this to the fullest extent possible.
What happens if we don't pursue this? What are the implications for the world?
Well, I mean, if we have no stance, then we're not competing, right? As countries that are on the fence as to whether or not they want China's concept of how to use technology on their people or ours, if we have no stance, it's not a competition, really. And so I think this is a very bad thing if we don't aggressively pursue this issue.
But if I may add, we need to see more coordinated political strategies to promote accountability. And we see, of course, China being very active with counter-propaganda, with counter-strategies, including at the United Nations. And I think we absolutely need to pursue legal accountability avenues. At the same time, I think the unified political strategy, that is part of the challenge. And I've noticed a fatigue, including among Western countries in that regard. And I find that very concerning, that the interest, of countries, including like Germany and France and now the United Kingdom, is engaging or re-engaging China, downplaying some of these issues, trying to go for kind of more the economic collaboration and geopolitical relationship to kind of navigate some of the insecurities we face also with the Russia-Ukraine war. But that's very problematic, and we see a reduced willingness to push back against the crimes of the CCP in that respect. I find it very concerning. That's why we need advocacy. But I think the Uyghur women, they need much more advocacy from women's rights groups. Where are they on the Uyghur issue? Where are women's rights groups? Where are feminists? Where are the different entities advocating for reproductive rights? When it comes to this atrocity, I mean, it's an unprecedented rights violation, a mass sterilization, documented. Where are these people? This is ridiculous, frankly, and I think there's a big gap here. And I'm very glad that you're having this event in the UN context on the status of women, because I think anybody caring about the status of women should be very concerned about what's happening to Uyghur women. And there's no reason to think why Uyghur women should be less important than anyone else.
Absolutely. The conversation on women's rights and reproductive rights is not intersectional unless it includes Uyghur women. And Rashan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I couldn't, repeat what Adrian just said enough. That's my frustration. That's 6-7 years. Just to conclude, I think we don't have that much time left. The same technologies used to oppress Uyghurs today, such as cameras in concentration camps, now monitoring government buildings, schools, and homes around the world. Just these technologies and their invasive use did not just stay contained within the Uyghur region. So what's happening to Uyghurs is not staying. What China is doing against the Uyghurs, Tibetans, or Hong Kongers, or Southern Mongolians. It's not staying within China's borders. They will not remain and confined, to only those marginalized ethnic groups right now. But in fact, the state has already begun to export their model of surveillance state to other countries. In total, 22 African countries now have contracted Chinese firms for the public security systems employed in China. And the more than 20 countries actually in Central Asia and the other parts using the same surveillance systems that China is using. All these are, supported by Beijing in the form of training programs and the law enforcement cooperation programs. So the spread of China's surveillance model normalizes intrusive state monitoring and enables other authoritarian regimes to follow the suit in cracking down on democracy and the dissent. So when you look down to it, it's not just about the Uyghur issue. This is about the freedom and human rights. This is a fight in between right and wrong and the good and the evil. So we have to continue to fight for good. We have to fight for rights, and we have to fight for the future of the free world that we will inherit for our next generations, for our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you so much to all of you. And I can't thank you enough for being here. And we just want to end this panel to bring it back to the Beijing Declaration Platform for Action. Some of the core principles of the declaration is the right to reproductive health and autonomy to uplift women out of poverty. But from hearing from all of you and from what we see that China has co-opted the language of this to justify its population control policies under the guise of promoting responsible parenthood and economic development. And we see that this is an absolute lie. And additionally, the declaration does not adequately address the role of digital surveillance technologies that now enables China to violate reproductive rights at an unprecedented scale. And China is a signatory of this declaration. And so at CFU, we are calling for a critical assessment and an amendment to the Beijing Declaration to clearly, one, indicate that the protection of reproductive rights should also include the freedom of women to decide whether, when, and how to bear children without influence or coercion from the government. The right to have a child is explicitly stated. To strengthen accountability measures by making state-enforced reproductive violations explicitly illegal with a clear pathway for prosecution and redress. Integrate specific protections against the misuse of digital surveillance, privacy violations that infringe upon reproductive rights, and include robust language that holds both state and non-state actors accountable for development and deployment of surveillance technology used to control women's bodies. We need to take urgent action to modernize the Beijing Platform for Action to reflect the realities of today's human rights landscape, and to protect women in the future as well. As Connor, Rashawn, and all of you have noted, these technologies and this model for repression as well will not stay within the bounds of China. I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you to our esteemed panelists for sharing your expertise with all of us. Thank you to our audience, all 680 of you. We really appreciate you being here. And please stay connected with Campaign for Uyghurs. We will be publishing and releasing a report that further talks about this issue in the next coming weeks. Please join our mailing list. Or follow us on socials to stay connected and keep up with the latest news. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a great Friday and evening.